To give a lecture named after Father James Schall is a true honor. When I think about Father Schall, I not only think about his wonderful personality, his great teaching ability, but his prodigious scholarship and writing. In fact, I remember joking with a friend saying that I think he writes with both hands. You know, it's amazing the amount of work that he produced over the years, not only scholarship, but also work that is accessible. And it is that accessibility that I hope to emulate here this evening in my own lecture. I was going to, because I think virtually no one's wearing a mask, I was actually going to say this joke, so I shouldn't tell you it's a joke before I say it, right? I was going to say that I'm so glad to see so many familiar masks. So never doubt Thomas. The Catholic Aquinas is Evangelical and Protestant. That title deserves an explanation. As Cindy said, I'm a revert. I left the Catholic Church as a very young man. I was 13 years old, and I'll have something to say about that in a few minutes. But in my journey back to the Church, it was really Thomas Aquinas and his work that I continually was drawn toward and illuminated some of the issues that were difficult for me during my time as a kind of budding philosopher. The title, the subtitle, what I'm trying to drive at there, and I'll tell you why I gave it that subtitle in terms of the issues discussed in the book. There are 4 issues over which Protestants and Catholics, and even between different Christians within the same tradition, dispute. And Aquinas, I think, can be helpful in us understanding them. So the first issue that I discuss in the book, and I'm actually going to come back to that towards the end of the lecture, and that is the issue of natural law and natural theology. So one of the disagreements that usually arises between certain evangelicals and Catholics has to do with whether we can know things about God and the moral law through our natural reason, that is, reason without the benefit of divine revelation. And certain evangelicals believe that that belief diminishes our reliance on divine revelation and also does not truly appreciate the severity of the fall or the noetic effects of sin upon our cognitive abilities. And so they think that the Catholic Church and Aquinas overrate these abilities. What I discovered when reading Aquinas is that, in fact, Aquinas says all the same things about the noetic effects of sin that, in fact, evangelicals believe in. So that's why when the subtitle says, a Catholic Aquinas says evangelical and Protestant. So there's a sense in which the Catholic Aquinas aligns himself with evangelicals. Now, another issue I deal with is the doctrine of justification. That's in the second to the last chapter of the book. And the doctrine of justification is the doctrine over which the Reformation arose. The question that had to be answered had to do with the relationship between faith and works and the role that grace plays in our performance of those works. And there are certain evangelical scholars, some of whom I knew, they've since passed away, that argued that Aquinas got the doctrine of justification right, and only if the Catholic Church had stuck with Aquinas, we wouldn't have needed the Reformation. And among the thinkers who thought this way or made this argument, were, some of you may have heard of these gentlemen, R.C. Sproul, John Gerstner, two great Reform scholars, and also Norm Geisler, who recently passed away, who was the founder of Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one of the reasons why I think they read Aquinas that way is that Aquinas is writing about justification and grace and the way in which God interacts with us without the acrimony of the divisions that arise at the Reformation. And there's another reason too. They just love Aquinas and they don't want him to be wrong. And so in that sense, the Catholic Aquinas is also, so in a way, these evangelicals who hold to what they think is a Reformation view of grace and justification, and yet are drawn to Aquinas, they're a lot more Catholic than they think. Now, the two other issues I deal with in the book, in the middle chapters, one has to do with a question that arose, it's actually been bandied about for quite some time, but it's one that became quite prominent in the media in late 2015 when a professor at Wheaton College was eventually terminated because she said in a Facebook post that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. And I think Aquinas can be really helpful here in understanding why I think she was right, but not in the way she thinks that she was right. So for Aquinas believed that we could know things about God, as I said earlier, by the use of our natural reason. So supposing you are, let's say, offering an argument for God's existence to somebody, and they're convinced that God exists. And who is God? God is the creator and sustainer of all that exists. He is almighty, all-powerful, all-loving, and simple. He is the being that has underived existence. Everything else has existence that's derived from him. Supposing somebody comes to that conclusion, and you're trying to get them to become Catholic, and you know what? They come to believe in God, but they become Muslim instead of Catholic. Now, supposing you have another friend who is an atheist. You convince him of the existence of God by the same kind of argument. He comes to the same conclusion about the nature of God. God is all-powerful, simple, all-loving, and has underived existence. Right? Same attributes. And then it turns out he wants to be received into the Catholic Church. Does he believe in the same God as the other guy? Of course he does. The difference has to do with that they have different faiths. And so Aquinas makes a distinction between the preambles of faith and the articles of faith. And so how somebody comes to believe in God, perhaps as a result of an intellectual argument, like the two individuals I mentioned earlier, they accept the preambles of faith. That is, or at least an aspect of the preambles of faith about the nature and existence of God. But then when they are moved to believe in what they think is a special revelation, whether it is the Quran or the Christian Bible, those are things that they believe are specially revealed by God to human beings that can't be accessed through natural reason. So it turns out that the Muslim and the Catholic disagree with each other, right, about things but those are things that can only be specially revealed through God himself. They are obviously inconsistent with each other and contrary to each other. So what I argue in this chapter is that, yes, Muslims, Christians, and Jews worship the same God, but they don't share the same faith. And that those aren't the same things. And I think the professor at Wheaton was offering more of a kind of, and I don't want to read too much into her motives, but I suspect it was a much more of a kind of maybe squishy ecumenicalism or ecumenism, right? And Wheaton College was not at that time willing to award her the John Lennon Chair in Nothing to Kill or Die For and No Religion Too. So I think that she was right, and I defended her, and received a lot of criticism for it. But I think she was correct, and I think what Aquinas can help us see is that in one sense she is correct, right? But you can say she's correct about that without at the same time having to sort of deny what you believe is true about your own faith. Okay, and then the other chapter in the book where I think Aquinas can be helpful in terms of how Catholics and evangelicals think about things, and it's in the area of science and theology. So over the past 20 years or so, there has been a movement among mostly evangelical Christians called the Intelligent Design movement. And very early on in that movement, about 20 years ago, I had written several law review pieces defending the teaching of intelligent design in public schools. In fact, it was the basis of the dissertation that I wrote for my degree that I earned at WashU Law School 20 years ago. And I really had a sympathy for that movement and what they were trying to do. But as I began reading Aquinas and seeing how he described God as creator, I became much more skeptical of that position. In fact, to the point where I'm critical of the intelligent design position. Now, I want to make something clear. As Catholics, or as a Catholic, I believe God designed the universe, and I believe God obviously created it. But the way in which intelligent design theorists argue for design, I think, diminishes the role that how God acts. And let me just give you a brief explanation of this. So, some of the intelligent design defenders will say something like this. They'll say that if there is an aspect of nature that seems to be designed, it seems to be complex in a particular kind of way, if we can exclude the explanations of chance and law. So think of something like rolling dice, right? So you roll dice and you get 2 6s, right? There's a certain probability in that if you did it, let's say, 20 times in a row, right, you would have to infer that there was some kind of explanation other than chance, right? You would say that there's some mischief going on, right? Supposing I walked into a casino in Vegas, and where I grew up, by the way, nobody really grows up in Vegas. You just get older. So imagine if, I just roll the dice and I get 5 6s in a row. Well, I'll tell you one thing. There'll be, the pit boss will call over the dealer. And there'll be some investigation, right? They understand probability theory, right? So the ID guys, what they do is they say, well, there are parts of nature that are like that, and if it can't be explained by chance or law, then there has to be an explanation of a designer, some kind of mind behind it. But the thing that Aquinas taught me, though, was that God just didn't create those slivers of nature of highly complex things that don't seem to be explainable by chance or law. He created the chance and law too. And I think that if you, let's say, debate with the new atheist over the existence of God, and it's over this very thin sliver of nature, you're giving away too much real estate to unbelief. As Catholics and Christians, we believe that God created the chance and the law, not just those parts of nature that at this point don't seem explicable in terms of chance and law. It teaches the wrong lesson about divine action, because imagine if, let's say, 20 years from now, there is a scientific theory that can account for what seems to be inexplicable at this point. Are we saying then, therefore, God no longer is necessary to account for the universe, right? Or at least that part of nature, right? one of the things that Aquinas teaches, and the church teaches, is that God doesn't need space in nature to act. And this actually helps us understand the relationship between works and faith and grace. That is, when we talk about doing good works because we are moved by the grace that God has imparted to us, He gets all the credit for that, and yet we cooperate with that grace. And so there isn't a zero-sum game, and that's also true of creation as well. So it isn't as if God needs this space to act. If you do that, then what you're doing, you're treating God as just another creature or having the same kind of powers as creatures. And so those four issues, natural law, natural theology, the issue of intelligent design, divine action and nature, justification, and the same God question. On those four issues, I think that Aquinas can be illuminating. Now, let me say a few things about how Aquinas was instrumental in my journey back to the Catholic Church. Reversion stories are actually a little bit more interesting than philosophy. More people watch The Journey Home than they do philosophy YouTube videos, right? So I returned to the Catholic Church in April of 2007 while I was president of the Evangelical Theological Society. I resigned a week after returning to the church. So for 1 week, the Evangelical Theological Society had a Catholic president. They can't change that. That will forever be true. Not even God can change that, because He can't change the past. Well, that's another philosophical issue. So I went to confession for the first time in over 30 years. I went to confession at a small parish outside of Waco called St. Jerome's, and went into confession, and I said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." It has been over 30 years since my last confession. I can't remember them all. And he just said, "Just give me general categories." And it was 2 Hail Marys and Our Father. And my wife filed a protest for my penance. So what led me there? What led me back to the church, and how did Aquinas factor into that? Well, as I said, I grew up Catholic. I left the church in the early 1970s or mid-1970s. My parents had a friend, an older gentleman named Frank Strabela, who went to their house evangelizing them. He was actually Catholic, but he was part of the Catholic charismatic movement, and left on my parents' coffee table a copy of the New Testament. It was one of those Good News for Modern Man New Testaments. I don't know if you know about the New English translation. There are little stick figures in it. And I didn't know it was a Bible. I just began reading it. I mean, I didn't know it was a Bible. Yeah, I was Catholic. Okay. And I was really drawn to the person of Christ in the book. And so I called up my parents' friend, and he offered to pick me up every Thursday night and take me to this Jesus People Church in downtown Las Vegas. And so my parents let him do it, which is astonishing to me. And I went there it was called Maranatha House. It was one of these old houses built in the 1920s in downtown Las Vegas, and there were a bunch of hippies there, and they had their acoustic guitars, and we sang praise songs, and they had a library, though, in the church. And I gravitated to that. And it was there that I began reading books on theology and listening to these tapes. And I continued to go there. And then in high school, kind of went through a period of unbelief. And then towards the end of my high school years, my senior year, went back to attending evangelical churches. And what drew me to those churches was a kind of seriousness of faith. I went to 12 years of Catholic school. I'm not sure I was catechized very well. It was during a very tumultuous period in American Catholic history. I'll never forget the change in 1969. We had these Filipino nuns that had taught at the elementary school I had attended. They were very traditional nuns, wearing those rosaries with the size of a real guy on the cross. I mean, they were serious nuns, and then all of a sudden, the next year, there were nuns that were there that didn't dress like sisters, and all the religion classes changed. We started reading things like Jonathan Livingston Seagull. So there was a complete sea change, and it was 2 or 3 years later that I began finding myself as a very young teenager, 12, 13 years old, attending these evangelical churches, and then again at the end of my high school time. But I still retained very much a love of learning theology and philosophy. And I suspect that probably had a lot more to do with my Catholic formation than I had thought. Right? I sometimes, as I have already done so this evening, been critical of my catechization, but they did something right, right? Because that was retained. And went to college and majored in philosophy. One more thing, I forgot to mention this. When I was 13, my parents were troubled by the fact that I was going to this evangelical church, and so they signed me up for a 4-day retreat at a local Catholic center in Las Vegas that was run by the Dominicans. And that was the first time I'd heard about Thomas Aquinas. I would go up. I attended every one of these meetings. There was prayer and lectures on the spiritual life and theology. And I had my Bible. I'd bring my big leather Bible with me, and I would walk up to the priests and start asking questions and interrogating them. I was really an annoying little 13-year-old. And they were so patient and kind to me. But I can easily imagine my Italian mother, talking to my dad saying, "Oh, maybe the Dominicans will help." They did stick with me because one of them did bring up Thomas Aquinas. And when I was at a Christian bookstore in the end of my senior year in high school, I was talking to the owner, and I said, "Do you have any books on philosophy? I want to, And he said, "Yeah, there's one here by a guy named Norm Geisler, but he's kind of weird. He's a evangelical that likes Thomas Aquinas." And I had remembered Thomas Aquinas. So I picked that book up, and it was called Philosophy of Religion. I frankly didn't understand 90% of it. Later on, when I went to college, I reread it. I understood more of it. And Norm, who became a friend years later, in that book really offers a kind of defense of the existence of God, religious experience, and answers the problem of evil in a Thomistic fashion. And so very early on, I began appropriating a Thomistic Catholic view of the intellectual life. After my time in college, I went on to study for my PhD at Fordham University in New York City. Why Fordham? It's a Catholic school. I was an evangelical. Well, I didn't know really where to go to graduate school. Nobody in my family had ever gone to graduate school before. My father had a bachelor's degree in business administration. There wasn't any online rankings of departments and doctoral programs and all that kind of stuff that kids have today. And so I talked to a couple of my professors, and I applied to 3 schools: Claremont Graduate University, because one of my profs recommended it, and University of Southern California, because Dallas Willard taught there, and he was a prominent evangelical philosopher. And then Fordham, because my mom said in her Brooklyn accent, you should go to Fordham. That was it. And so I applied there, and they offered me a fellowship, and I had the opportunity to study under two great Thomists, Father Gerald McCool and Father Norris Clark, and I didn't know who they were. I just thought, these are priests that teach philosophy, and I'm interested in this stuff, so I'll take their classes. And in McCool's class on medieval humanism, I read for the first time Augustine's Confessions, and I remember writing in the margins of my copy of the Confessions, in fact, I still have the copy of that book. It was, I think, edited by Vernon Bork, who I think was at St. Louis University. And I have a little line with an arrow pointed to a paragraph, and I say, this sounds really Catholic. Because as an evangelical, I mean, most of us were taught that Augustine, is a kind of paleo-Protestant in some ways, right? And I was sort of surprised by how Catholic he sounded. When I took Father Clark's class on Thomas Aquinas, I only read the portions of Aquinas that dealt with issues concerning faith and reason, issues concerning the existence of God, the belief in miracles, the existence of the soul, those sorts of things that evangelicals and Catholics have in common. But I left, nevertheless, Fordham as a committed Thomist, a confused Thomist. The late Ralph McInerney would have called me a peeping Thomist, though I like to think I was a doting Thomist. That actually was the original title of this book, called Doting Thomist, and Baylor University Press, which published this, didn't like it. And so by your reaction, they made a good choice. So I then, after earning my doctorate, actually before that I got married. I married a woman who I'm still married to named Frankie. So we are Frank and Frankie. In fact, she is now, I think she's watching on YouTube. And I was hired by the school at which I earned my bachelor's degree, the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And soon after being hired, the department chair there asked me to teach classes in political and moral philosophy, an area that I had an interest in, but I had not done much work in graduate school. And as somebody that was a cultural and social conservative, I wanted to introduce my students to philosophers that defended those traditional points of view. And virtually every philosopher that I found who defended those points of view were Catholics. And so I began reading several Catholic thinkers. Father Schall is one of them, John Finnis, John Courtney Murray, and a host of others. And I remember reading Evangelium Vitae, John Paul II's encyclical on the Gospel of Life. And it was during that time that I began working on a book, and actually have published several books on abortion and the sanctity of human life. And then John Paul II released Fide et Ratio, his encyclical on faith and reason, and I could not put that down. I remember calling one of my philosopher friends who's an evangelical, J.P. Moreland, who teaches at Biola. And I called J.P. Because J.P.'s understanding of faith and reason, as I began reading Fide et Ratio, it occurred to me that J.P. would find this consistent with his own ideas. So I called up J.P. and I read him a paragraph and I asked him to guess who it was. And he never guessed the Pope. He reeled off the names of all these very prominent evangelical philosophers. I said, it's the Pope. And he says, wow, I guess he's one of us. And sure enough, yes, he is. So I began appropriating more and more of Catholic thinking, but sort of indirectly through these moral and social questions, never thinking about issues concerning ecclesiology, the nature of the church, or the sacraments. Those things didn't really interest me. But my wife was interested in those things. So when we were living in Southern California in the 90s, we had friends that invited us to a local Episcopal church that they were attending, called St. James Episcopal in Newport Beach. And we began attending their mid-morning service that was very similar to the Novus Ordo Mass that my parents attended in the Catholic Church. So my wife, who had no background in Catholicism or high church liturgy, asked me the first time we were there, she goes, this is really Catholic. Why don't we go to the Catholic Church? And I said, no, we can't do that. The Catholics are wrong here and here and here. And she goes, so for her, she was drawn to the liturgical, beautiful parts of that aspect of Christianity. It's not a coincidence that she is also a stained glass artist. Several years later, as I'm spending a year at Princeton University. I was sharing this story earlier with Cindy, and at that time, there were several other visiting fellows besides myself, one of whom is Hadley Arcus. I don't know if you know who Hadley Arcus is. So Hadley called me up one evening and asked me why I wasn't Catholic. And so I spent about a half an hour explaining to him why I wasn't Catholic, and he said, those are very lame reasons. And I said, what do you care? You're not Catholic. He wasn't at the time, he is now. And he says, well, if you walk down the aisle, I'll walk with you. And so I only found out years later, actually at his baptism and confirmation in this very room, that my brother, one of my brothers, my younger brother Patrick, very devout Catholic, called up Hadley Arcus and Robbie George and said, you have to help my brother return to the Catholic Church. And so they plotted together to figure out who was going to ask me. And so it was Hadley that was given the task. I did not know that until right before walking in for Hadley's baptism, confirmation, and First Holy Communion, in which this gentleman, Father Schall, was one of the celebrants. And so Robbie told the whole story. I did not know that. And I wish I had. I would have included that story in the book. So during that time, more people began asking me why I wasn't Catholic. And several of my friends converted to Catholicism. And finally, I decided to spend considerable amount of time with one of those friends, Jay Bujoszewski. Jay is a University of Texas professor of government and philosophy, and converted to Catholicism in, I believe, 2003. And he and I were both speakers at the University of Dallas. And the morning after we had both spoke, we had breakfast together with our wives, and I asked Jay, explain to me why you returned to the Catholic Church. And I told him the 4 issues that were the most difficult for me. And they were the sacrament of penance, the Catholic doctrine of justification, apostolic succession, and the nature of the Eucharist. And so he encouraged me to begin reading the Church Fathers on these issues. And so I began doing that. And I had at home the collection of about half the writings of the Church Fathers that I had actually purchased as a 15-year-old. I had purchased them because I wanted to be able to answer Mormon missionaries that knocked on my door, who had said things that the classical Christian concept of God is really stolen from Plato and Aristotle. And so I wanted to prove to them that no matter how far back you go in the history of the church, this doctrine of God is found. And so I went and bought at a Christian bookstore the early church fathers. So but I never looked at them or read them concerning these particular issues. And so I did that. And the thing that stood out was not only did my hero Thomas Aquinas hold all these views, but he would often cite fathers deep in the history of the church, including Augustine, on these very questions. And so the other thing that occurred to me is that on the very issues over which, or on which, Protestants and Catholics agree, like the Trinity and the deity of Christ and the inspiration of Scripture, no church council, at least until after the first millennium, was ever convened to settle that question. Everyone those questions on which they agree, there were councils that were convened, right? So I kind of messed that up. So so if you go back to the Council of Nicaea, Chalcedon were convened to settle these questions about the nature of Christ, the nature of the Trinity, and so forth. Those are the things over on which Catholics and Protestants agree. But where do they disagree? On issues like the Eucharist, penance, apostolic succession, those were not ever debated. They were just presupposed as sort of true. And so to me, the thing that really stood out about the fathers was how matter-of-factly they talked about these things. And so I'd reached a point where I concluded that the Catholic Church could be right about these things. And so I thought, I have to read other people on this to see how they respond. And so one of the books I read was a book by Mark Noll called Is the Reformation Over? Mark Noll is, I think, just recently retired history professor from the University of Notre Dame, who is a evangelical. He had actually taught for quite some time at Wheaton College before he moved to Notre Dame. And I read the book, and the thing that really stood out in the book was how much Noll and his co-author praised the Catholic Catechism. And he said, you know, evangelicals can agree with like 90% of it. And I found that shocking. And then I thought, I have to read some reviews of this book, the critical reviews by evangelicals. And I did. And one of the reviews was by Carl Trueman. Some of you may know of Carl Trueman. He just actually published an outstanding book on the nature of the human person, where he deals with the roots of much of our debates today about transgender. I wrote an endorsement for the book. I right now cannot remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it is an outstanding book. I've since become very good friends with Carl, but at the time I did not know Carl Trueman. He had reviewed the Noll book for a website called Reformation 21, which is a Reformed website. And this is what Carl says in his review. He says, "Every year I tell my Reformation history class that Roman Catholicism is, at least in the West, the default position. Rome has a better claim to historical continuity and institutional unity than any Protestant denomination, let alone the strange hybrid that is evangelicalism. In the light of these facts, therefore, we need good, solid reasons for not being Catholic. Not being a Catholic should, in other words, be a positive act of will and commitment, something we need to get out of bed determined to do each and every day. It would seem, however, that if Noll and his co-author are correct, many who call themselves evangelical really lack any good reason for such an act of will. And the obvious conclusion, therefore, should be that they do the decent thing and rejoin the Roman Catholic Church. I cannot go down that path myself, primarily because of my view of justification and because of my ecclesiology. But those who reject the former and lack the latter have no real basis upon which to perpetuate what is, in effect, an act of schism on their part. For such, the Reformation is over. For me, the fat lady is yet to sing. In fact, I am not sure at this time that she has even left her dressing room." Unquote. So that when I read that, it occurred to me immediately that the burden was on me, not on the church. That my parents had baptized me in the Catholic Church, in the Latin Rite, and that I was in schism with the church, and that I needed a good reason not to be in schism, or to remain in schism. And so at that point, I went to my wife, and I said, I think I'm going to return to the Catholic Church. And she said, it's about time. And so we met with a priest that had actually befriended us when we first arrived at Baylor University, Father Timothy Vaverick, to whom this book, Never Doubt Thomas, is dedicated. Father Timothy still lives in the area and is a pastor at St. Mary of the Assumption in West Texas, is the unofficial Catholic chaplain of Baylor University. And I count him as one of the many people at Baylor, Catholics, who were instrumental in making it much easier for me to return to the church. So that's what got me to the point at which I went to confession. And so I didn't have to go to RCIA. All I had to do to go to confession. My wife, on the other hand, because she had not been confirmed or had received Holy Communion, she had to go through RCIA, but she got a special deal. She was received into the church a month after me, under the condition that she would go to RCA afterwards, and under the condition that she gave to me is I had to attend with her. So I went to RCIA with her for 6 months. So what's the lesson here of Aquinas? I'm going to wrap things up and then open the floor for questions. When I taught at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, I had a student who never hesitated to challenge me in class. One day, after I had told the class that the primary point of studying philosophy is the pursuit of truth, she immediately asked the question, why is the truth important? And I responded instantaneously, do you want the true answer or the false one? So in the rhetorical quip, I was trying to make the point that sometimes the answers to our questions are right under our noses. But we often do not have the presence of mind to realize it or even know where to look. I kind of feel that way about how Aquinas is thought sort of worked in my own life, both in terms of these issues of faith and reason which dominate this book, and also those issues concerning those doctrines that were important in dealing with when returning to the church. Now, having lived on both sides of the Tiber, I'm keenly aware of the pitfalls of reading one's theological rivals, not to mention one's ecclesial patrimony, without charity, inquisitiveness, or imagination. For this reason, it is fitting that we end this talk with these prayerful words penned by Thomas Aquinas, creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your light penetrate the darkness of my understanding. Thank you. Thank you. So I think we have time for about, 15 minutes or so of questions? Okay, so any questions?
Please just raise your hand and I will come to you with this microphone.
It's a great story. Is this microphone here? Oh. I just was curious, do you find yourself, if witnessing the right word, to Protestants, evangelicals, and try to share your story with them?
I have on several occasions talked with pastors who have contacted me. Now, I don't go door to door, or anything like that, but I've had I think since 2007 at least 20 to 30 evangelical pastors, some professors. I had one friend who teaches at a well-known Protestant seminary in the Dallas area, and we met halfway between Waco and Dallas because he was afraid that he would be seen with me in a restaurant. Now, not that, but, because he had shown, at least in his own writings and teaching, some sympathy for Catholicism. So I've had many of those. I've had students talk to me. In fact, when I was contemplating returning to the church, I had one student come to my office. When I first taught at Baylor, I was not in the philosophy department. I was in a center there called the Institute for Church-State Studies, and it used to have a doctoral program. And so one of those doctoral students, who was an ordained Baptist minister, came to my office and he said, "My wife and I are thinking of becoming Catholic." And I had not decided in my own mind what I was going to do. So I had this thinking, some of you may disagree with me on this, but I think that and it depends, I think, on the person. Because I didn't want to talk this guy out of being Baptist, because what if it turned out that was the only kind of Christianity he found plausible? And so if he turned out to give up his Baptist faith, he'd become nothing. So I mean, there's that. So I've written a little bit of this called Intrachristian Apologetics. So I think as Catholics, for those who are here who are Catholic, I think we do have an obligation to answer people's questions, to give them answers. We also, I think, in some cases, actually make an affirmative defense of our faith and engage in evangelism. I don't dispute that. But I think that in some context, you sort of have to engage in a little bit of prudence, right? So, I mean, I know of, for example, bad Catholics. I know bad Catholics who are, it's either going to be a bad Catholic or an atheist. There's no way on God's green earth he'll ever be an evangelical. So I think you have to be, and I think there are evangelicals that would never entertain being Catholics. And so when you're trying to, let's say, draw them to the church, I think it's always good to emphasize what the church offers them and not to sort of be too critical of their particular faith. But it depends, right? Some people, it's okay to be critical. They want to mix it up, right?
Thank you. I'd probably qualify as somebody who'd be a bad Catholic or an atheist, just so you know. So 2 questions. The first one is, obviously, at least in my view, the embrace of Thomism by the church, particularly in the late 19th century, had a lot to do with the dialogue with modernity, right, and liberal reason. So to the extent to which we are going to Protestantize Aquinas, if you'll forgive that, does that undermine that dialogue with modernity? And maybe that's more important. And number 2, if we are to think about ecumenical virtues and prioritize that over the dialogue with modernity, is Aquinas a barrier with respect to, let's say, the Eastern Orthodox Church, vis-a-vis the difference in their understanding of God and the essence-energies distinction versus the Thomistic view?
Yeah, great questions. Concerning the first, concerning the question, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you're asking about the role of Thomistic thought in interacting with.
Well, Thomas obviously prioritizes reason.
That's right. Yeah, I don't. He does do that, to be sure, but I'm not. I don't know. Maybe this is my reading of Thomas on reason. I think if remember he at least the Summa Theologica is written for young seminarians, right? And he's sort of giving them the faith, right? But it's not. I don't think it's pastoral. I mean, in the sense that, so like one of the things I didn't have time to talk about, it's actually in my notes. I was going to, one of the criticisms that's leveled against Thomism by certain evangelicals, one of whom I quote Carl Henry, is that Thomas teaches that you need an argument before you have faith in God. And one of the things that Thomas is careful about is the clue that he rejects that. Why? Because, first off, because most people don't have time for this kind of stuff, right? They are going to church and receiving the sacraments, right? I think, for example, of my grandmother, my sainted Italian grandmother, who I lived with while I was in graduate school at Fordham. I lived with my Italian grandma in Brooklyn, who was a daily mass communicant, while her Protestant grandson was going to study with the Jesuits. Sounds like a sitcom, right? So I think about her, like if she recited every Sunday Mass the Nicene Creed, I don't think she would know what consubstantial with the Father, the Son is consubstantial with the Father, right? I mean, so and Aquinas addresses that, right? That there are, that it's not every Christian is supposed to be a kind of philosopher, right? So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'm really addressing what you're driving at.
It maybe is a strategic question.
Yeah.
But the idea of the embrace of Thomism was a good way to fight modernity.
Okay.
Because he had such a strong rational interpretation.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Protestants him and we diminish him. We use that. Our ability to engage with modernity is lessened.
See, yeah, that's okay. I'm going to connect the two questions. I think that in a way, Protestantism is an extension of modernity, and so I do think giving, a Thomistic response to the modern understanding of reason and nature it's an more than adequate answer to those challenges, but it also is a way to answer, I think, some of the Protestant challenges about grace and works, because I do think the same issues concerning divine action and nature, I think, come up in both the issue of justification as well as some of the issues that get raised in the modern era about the role that God plays in creation and sustaining nature. So I don't know if that really answers it. Sorry. So this gentleman.
Here you go, sir.
Yeah, you didn't go into any great detail about this, and frankly, I can't say that I know a lot about it, but I would be interested to know whether you thought, for instance, Norman Geisler and R.C. Sproul misunderstood Thomas Aquinas, or if they misunderstood the Reformation.
It's a good question. I think I don't want to say they misunderstood the Reformation, because they knew the Reformation better than I do. Sproul himself, studied extensively Calvin and Luther, far beyond anything I've ever studied. I think they misunderstood Aquinas, and I think the reason why they misunderstood him, I think, was twofold. One, they found in Aquinas intellectual resources that they could not find in their own tradition. Ways of thinking about the relationship between faith and reason that they thought was helpful in defending their faith against modern understandings of reason. I think the other part of it is that and for that reason, they loved Aquinas, and they read into his understanding of grace something that they thought was not in the Council of Trent, so or any of the later Catholic documents that address issues concerning justification. Now, one of the things I point out in my chapter is I go through all the way back to Augustine, Council of Orange, Aquinas, Council of Trent, and Contemporary Catechism, and show that there's continuity in terms of that issue. So I think that they just didn't read Aquinas well, and I think it's because they just loved him, right? It's the same reason why sometimes we don't see things in people we love, right? So I think it's the same kind of thing. Now, there's one thing about Geisler, though, is I think he also misread the church fathers on this. So one of the things I did when Jay Bujoszewski encouraged me to read the fathers is that I read several systematic theology textbooks written by evangelicals that dealt with justification, but also claimed to rely on the fathers. And one of them was Geisler's 4 volumes, which I actually wrote an endorsement for. when I was an evangelical. And so I read that section, and I went through each one of the quotes. I think he had about maybe a dozen quotes from different church fathers, Cyril of Jerusalem, John Chrysostom, Augustine, several of them. And I would go back to the original, and like, for example, the one from Chrysostom, if you read it in isolation of the surrounding text, he sounds like John Calvin. But if you read, let's say, the next page, Chrysostom is talking about praying for the dead. And so, well, how did Norm miss that? And so I think that there was a kind of, not that, I don't think it was intentional. I think once he found what he liked, he just didn't read anymore. Right? So, I mean, I think that's the explanation that makes the most sense. I think we can all fall for that, by the way, and I probably have done that myself on numerous occasions.
You don't think Aquinas was a Protestant?
No, I do not. I'm not making that argument at all. Oh, no, not even close. No, I'm making the argument that Protestants that there's two types of Protestants I'm dealing with in this book. There's the Protestants that like Aquinas but read back into his doctrine of his view of justification something that he really didn't hold. In other words, if you read Aquinas, as I think you should read him, he's in perfect continuity with his predecessors and successors. And then there's the other kind of Protestant, like Carl Henry, an anti-Thomist, who says, look, the Thomistic project is this hyper-rationalistic view of faith, and Aquinas and the Catholic Church are teaching you need an argument before you have faith, but that's crazy, right? And I think that's wrong too. In fact, Aquinas himself says, if that were the case, we would be guilty of Pelagianism. That means that there would have to be an intellectual work that someone would have to have before they could have faith. And that clearly has been rejected by the church. So no, I'm not saying Aquinas was a Protestant.
We're going to take this gentleman with the final question. However, if you have questions or would like to chat with Professor Beckwith, he will be outside in just a few moments during the book signing.
Thank you very much. Oh, one more question.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So it's more of a spiritual, I don't know.
Sure.
How do you maintain the healthy balance on faith and reason? Sometimes I find myself justifying with all the reasoning I have. Whatever I like to do, I justify with my reasoning. So how do you have that healthy balance?
I think, are you married, by the way? Okay, so I'm going to use a marriage illustration. So imagine you woke up every morning and you rehearsed the arguments of why you married your wife. You got up and you go, oh, what a great day. Oh, she's this, that, and that was the reason why you stay married. I guarantee you would not stay married. Because what would happen, it would be just totally based on this sort of intellectual working through. Right? Think of your relationship to God and the church as like a marriage, right? You give your entire self to it, right? You give your entire self to your spouse, to your wife, and there are reasons to be sure, right? But it's more than just reason, and this is why I think that you need a devotional life, a life of prayer, right? Think about anything. I mean, even outside of faith, outside of marriage, if you treated everything as a mere intellectual exercise based on reason, you probably wouldn't stay in your job very long either, right? So what I think makes the Catholic view of faith and reason so attractive, or at least made it attractive to me, was that it kind of is commonsensical, right? Like that's the way, most of the ways in which we think about or engage life, right? We have reasons for things, but we also inherit certain traditions and ways of doing things that are, in a sense, reasonable, but we never argue for them, right? I mean, we just sort of accept them. It's part of the given, right? So I think, so for me, I think what's really been helpful to me, when I was an evangelical, and I would think I was overly rationalistic. And this is going to sound counterintuitive to some Catholics, but I think one of the features, at least of the evangelical, the world of intellectuals evangelical intellectuals is that there is a kind of hyper-rationalism, that everything is sort of has to be argued for. You need a reason for everything. And I think the Catholic view, what I like, as I said, drew me to it was that there's room for mystery, right? I mean, the idea that, it occurred to me about 5 years ago. The idea that I have to understand everything about God in order to believe in Him makes God not worthy of belief. It's like, I don't want to. If I can understand God, then, what's the point? Right? So, so the whole ineffability of God, His incomprehensibility, which when I was younger was not attractive. I thought, I want to understand everything. I want to understand every argument. I want to know everything that I could possibly know to defend my faith. And the reality is that very few people come to faith through intellectual arguments, right? Some do, but most people don't. They come to faith because they most often will see examples of people that are able to live a life of devotion at the same time, show themselves to be fully informed people that are willing to address these questions, right? So it's a much more complex thing. So how do what I do, I try as much as I can to feed my soul as much as my mind. So.
And why do you think very knowledgeable people sometimes have very poor reasoning towards God or spiritual life or interior life?
Why do people?
Yeah, some people are very knowledgeable about so many things, but when it comes to reasoning about God and interior life, it's very poor.
I don't know. So, I really can't answer. I think it may have to do with the way in which they've been educated, right? So, if you've read, for example, maybe this is not a great example, but I think the book The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins is an example of a very, very smart man, well informed about the sciences, who has worse than a Sunday school view of the nature of Christian faith or any other faith for that matter. And I think part of the problem is the church doesn't do enough evangelism addressing those kinds of criticism. So how that happens, I don't know. I'm always amazed when I run into somebody, let's say that is an ex-Catholic. I had many of people write on my blog when I announced that I returned to the church, saying things like, I grew up Catholic and I know it's wrong, right? And of course, I grew up Catholic too. and it turned out that I didn't know anything, and so I'm assuming you don't know anything either, right? That's, and I had the benefit of a graduate degree from a Catholic institution, right? So I think it's, and we also can't underestimate the power and the draw of just novelty, right? So imagine I was catechized well. Well, I might have stayed in the church, but I don't know if the evangelical friends of mine and their presentation wouldn't have been attractive anyways, right? I don't know. There is something, when you're a teenager, you sort of don't want to be like mom and dad, right? So there's all these factors that come into play that have nothing to do with reason. So, all right. Well, I guess that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.